moment now, Governor Ron DeSantis will hold a press conference in Panama City, Florida. Over the weekend, former Vice President Mike Pence hit back at DeSantis. DeSantis is going to be there. But the former vice president hit back at DeSantis, saying that Russia's war on Ukraine is not vital to American interests. Pence also said that he thinks that there will be, quote, better choices for 2024 presidential candidates. Okay. Well, CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro has been following all of this for us from Washington. Aaron, good to see you. So listen, all this talk about a possible indictment for the former president, what sort of impact could that have on his 2024 presidential campaign? I mean, right now, seeing as he projected he was going to be arrested tomorrow, it's got us all talking about him, and it has some of his opponents even kind of sort of supporting him.
Right. It cuts both ways politically for former President Trump. First, it could reactivate his base. He has said at CPAC earlier this year that he is, quote, their retribution. He's talked a lot about his legal cases and how he feels he's being persecuted. And this post from the weekend ties into a lot of the rhetoric he has used with his diehard supporters. But the timing of this potential indictment also comes the week he is set to hold his first campaign rally in 2024. That'll be in Waco, Texas this Saturday. Trump and his campaign have also sent multiple fundraising emails about this indictment and have highlighted how the rest of the field, including Nikki Haley and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who hasn't launched yet, still haven't said anything on this topic. But for some Republican primary voters, and we have heard on the road from a handful that say they like Trump but think he's not electable, they think he has too much baggage, this indictment or whatever comes of it could just add to that and potentially sway them to look harder at some non-Trump options. And lastly, I would just note it is early. It'll be a long 2024 campaign. And if you look back to the search at Mar-a-Lago last summer, the thought then was that it could help Republicans politically. The party, of course, had the lackluster midterms because there were so many other issues and stories going on that were top of mind for voters. So we'll see how this all fits in once the 2024 race really gets heated.
Yeah, you're right. There's a long way to go, Aaron, but LOL, we're talking about it now.
Right.
So let's talk about former Vice President Mike Pence, who spoke out this weekend. He called any possible indictment against Trump politically charged and even criticized Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over his stance in Ukraine. I thought it was remarkable, Aaron, you probably did as well, Anne-Marie, when I think Jonathan Karl from ABC played audio tape and videotape of the protesters on January 6th calling for the death of Mike Pence, how he sort of was wishy-washy about it. I mean, he talked about being angry, but, you know, even when he was asked if Donald Trump is ultimately the 2024 presidential nominee, would you vote for him? Would you support for him? He didn't really give an unequivocal answer with regards to that. So what is Pence's lane here? I mean, he's trying to distance himself from Trump, but he kind of still likes Trump, at least if he's the nominee. He's angry about what happened on January 6th, but not angry enough to denounce the former president. What's going on here?
He's tiptoeing a bit. He's trying to define himself as that candidate and break a bit slightly, edge by edge, from Trump's shadow. And Pence has gradually been creating more contrast with Trump, starting with January 6th, but also on other issues such as reforming Social Security and Medicare and the Russian invasion into Ukraine. But this month especially, Pence has repeatedly said history will, quote, hold Trump accountable for his actions on January 6th. But at the same time, even though he disagreed with this expected indictment of Trump, he said in Iowa Trump can, quote, take care of himself. And he brought up how only one Iowan voter brought up the indictment to him this weekend, suggesting that Republican primary voters may care about other issues that Pence or the rest of the field wants to make more top of mind. But Pence's reference to DeSantis' stance on Ukraine is interesting as well. It's in line with a lot of the other congressional Republicans that disagree with DeSantis, saying that the war in Ukraine is not a priority for the U.S. Pence has said he will make a decision on the presidential run this spring. And if he does get in, both Trump and DeSantis will be those top two figures he'll try to have to create contrast with and find an opening in between or on the outside of to find success in a presidential primary.
You know, we mentioned some of the criticism that Ron DeSantis received after filling out that questionnaire, I guess, that he received about whether or not the war in Ukraine was of vital importance to the U.S. How is he responding to any of this criticism?
He's not. He's not. He very much is creating his own potential path for the presidency and is sticking to it. And that means not responding directly to Trump's attacks or any of the other field's attacks, really. He's been asked every now and then by reporters about this, and he often says he's focused on Florida and not fighting with other Republicans. But one Republican strategist told me if DeSantis does start to engage, it essentially makes him a candidate, which could open up some other logistical headaches ahead of when he wants to launch a run, which is expected to be after the legislative session ends in May. But DeSantis is known as a brawler in the political arena. Once he does get in, we could maybe start to see a shift in how he responds or talks about these attacks. But so far, given he is not an official candidate yet, though he is moving like he could be one, he has not responded at all to these attacks.
All right, Aaron, thank you.
Thanks for having me.